Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion of the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman. We now have transitioned from the room where it happens to the room where it happened, as the 6-week national drama playing out in a dilapidated courtroom in Lower Manhattan came to a swift culmination last Thursday, with the jury foreperson intoning guilty for each of the 34 felony charges against Donald Trump. The result brought an end not just to the trial itself, in which well-prepared prosecutors presented a compelling story that the defense was never able to counter, but also to a longer epic about whether the legal system was up to holding Trump accountable for any of his many charged crimes. Trump appeared expressionless at the first guilty and remained stoic as each and every juror affirmed they had found the evidence persuasive beyond a reasonable doubt. Yet his post-trial pronouncements have taken an even darker turn, and Republican leadership has fallen into line, calling the trial rigged and political. Those attacks, however, don't remotely jibe with what went on in the courtroom, where the few dozen observers saw a straightforward process, presided over by a judge who gave Trump every process due, and 12 conscientious jurors who in the wake of the verdict now look to be in the doxing crosshairs of the irate MAGA faithful. Once again, and for the last time, we've assembled for this podcast a great round table of people who were in the room where it happened, as was I. And to take us through the legal earthquake that we all witnessed in real time and assess the aftershocks that are just beginning, we welcome Jon Alter, an award-winning author, filmmaker, columnist, and MSNBC political analyst. He's the author of 5 political and historical books, and in 2021, he launched his Substack, which has been, by the way, a great source of information for this trial. Old Goats Ruminating with Friends. Thanks for joining, you old goat, Jon Alter.
Thanks, Harry.
We're all old goats now, old Trump goats. Maggie Haberman, a senior political correspondent for the New York Times and author of the 2022 book, Confidence Man, The Making of Donald Trump and the Breaking of America. Thanks so much for joining, Maggie.
Thank you.
And Hugo Lowell, a political investigations reporter in the Washington Bureau of The Guardian, covering Donald Trump and the DOJ. He is a regular political analyst on MSNBC. Good to see you, Hugo.
Good to see you.
Let's start with the view from the room where it happened. This week we had closing arguments. Seems like a long time ago, oddly. Then the charging conference, 2 days of deliberation punctuated by jury questions, and then 5:15 Thursday, East Coast time, the verdict itself. Just to take a minute or two, how'd the closing arguments go, did you think? And what was the feeling, in the courtroom after they were completed?
I felt that even though he was way too long, he was probably an hour and a half longer than he should have been, I thought that Josh Steinglass had the decided edge, and I was quite confident of a conviction of some kind, whether on 9 counts or 34 counts, after closing arguments were completed. So he traded brevity for thoroughness, as he said, but I think he had the jury with him as he was walking through what he called the mountain of evidence that prosecution had produced. And I thought his best moment was a moment of humor, where he took a risk, which is something that especially, local prosecutors, they don't really do that very often. And he took a risk that I think will live in legal history, and people will talk about it in law school. He was trying to deal with the biggest problem that the prosecution had, which was this October 24th call from Michael Cohen to Keith Schiller, Donald Trump's bodyguard. And Cohen had testified on direct that he called Trump to give him an update on the money, the hush money they were sending to Stormy Daniels. He got blindsided on cross by Todd Blanche, Trump's lead attorney. This is very unusual in court. It was bad staff work by Susan Hoffinger of the prosecution, who went on to redeem herself later in the trial. But basically, there were a whole series of text messages, many of you have heard about this, that indicated that the purpose of the call was to deal with this 14-year-old prankster who was harassing Michael Cohen. And the defense really scored on these points. The call lasted for 1 minute and 36 seconds. So what Steinglass, the prosecutor, did was he started a timer and he said, I'm going to role play here. And he put like a phone, a pretend phone up to his ear. And he started saying, hey, Keith, how you doing? I've got this problem with this guy that I told you about when I texted. He's harassing me. Can you call his parents and tell him?
And nice and slow paced, right? And even a few little pleasantries, right?
Yeah, little pleasantries. Hey, good to hear things are good. Hey, is the boss there? Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah. Hey, boss, I'm completing the payments to Stormy Daniels. And he says a few other things. And then he stops the timer, says 49 seconds. And it left a very clear, amusing message for the jury that Michael Cohen could have talked both about the 14-year-old prankster and about the hush money. And it really plugged the last hole, big hole that the prosecution had, and I think sealed the case.
Yeah, it was folksy and elegant at the same time. Other stray thoughts? We're gonna return to a broader assessment of the lawyers generally, but anything at the closing stand out to you, Maggie?
Yeah, so I agree with everything John said. I thought, that was quite a moment with Steinglass. There were also too many moments with Steinglass. His closing was very long, but I think it was a product and part of concerns that the defense had done some damage to Michael Cohen. And based on the jury verdict, we think not, or at least not enough. I was very struck by Todd Blanche. The Trump team is very good at sort of creating its own weather outside the courtroom. And I just want to take one moment to make an observation that so much of the outside the courtroom commentary had so little to do with what was actually happening in the courtroom and what the end result was.
I so agree with that.
What was striking to me about something that Blanche did, Blanche is not an experienced defense trial lawyer. Oh, he's not an experienced defense lawyer.
Yeah, he's a prosecutor.
He's a prosecutor. And so there's just a fundamental difference. And he doesn't have experience in state court in a meaningful way. And so there were aspects of his closing where you could see what he was trying to do. He was trying to say the words Michael Cohen and liar together over and over and over again. And defense lawyers will often tell you that has merit. And it may have, but I think that Blanche created his own, and I'm still not clear on exactly why they did this. Blanche began in his opening statement saying Trump didn't reimburse Michael Cohen. And they went on to try to suggest this was legitimate legal work, and they went through a lengthy walk on this. Steinglass, in his closing, was able to put on screen, here's Donald Trump's tweet in May of 2018, where Donald Trump said he reimbursed Michael Cohen. And just for those who aren't familiar with it, Trump also said that in an OGE, Office of Government Ethics filing that they did in that same month, after Rudy Giuliani went on TV that month and said Trump reimbursed Michael Cohen. And Trump said it again in his own interview with Fox in August of 2018. So Blanche created his own credibility problem with the jury by doing that. And the other thing I would just say about this, we really don't know a ton about these jurors. We know what they said during voir dire, during the selection process. What we do know is they are a pretty well-read jury. These are a lot of Times readers, a lot of CNN watchers, a lot of MSNBC. These are people who, some of these characters are probably familiar to them before the trial. And so I don't know what that goes into their impressions, but the Blanche moment was the most striking to me because it was the easiest one for Steinglass to point to and say, this is actually false.
I think also Todd had a problem with the Michael Cohen stuff because he put such an effort into painting him as a liar. And then when the defense got up to do its summation, Steinglass did a pretty good job of rebutting everything that Todd had just said. I mean, he was like, look, Cohen might have lied, but he was doing so at Trump's behest. I mean, it's very clear once you apply like common sense to some of what the timeline is, it's very clear. When Michael was still working with Trump under the joint defense agreement, when he testified to Congress and he lied on behalf of Trump, it makes sense, right? They were all together, they were all under a joint defense agreement. The moment that break happens, when Michael is no longer in the Trump camp and he's doing his own thing, then everything he says there is obviously going to be a contradiction of what he was saying when he was lying for Trump. And I think the inconsistency that was so readily presented to the jury was a problem for Todd Blanche.
I agree with that.
And I just want to make a few points as the former prosecutor or trial lawyer among us. First, I agree too long. I thought at first Steinglass was trying to get the judge to adjourn early so he could have a big chunk and then the last sort of hour the following day, which would have been ideal, but obviously he kept with it. But your point, Jon, of the even twice as long, more than that, as Blanche, he had a certain lightness and a very well-chosen instances of humor. I just remember as it got to about 6:45 or something, he said at one point, like a hockey coach talking to the team, can you guys do a few more? Can you know? And and they said yes. And you don't do that very much, but that's where his sort of, experience comes in. And then it was so clear to me that Blanche put in, that Steinglass put in maybe 200 hours in preparation and Blanche maybe 5. I mean, it wasn't simply that it was thorough, but it was so methodical, dynamic, individual sentences. He had rehearsed the pauses. And Blanche, to the great contrast, really seemed to be kind of figuring out where he was as he was going along. Part of, I think, what might have been going on, there's no doubt Steinglass did 4 run-throughs with his team. And they revised it and took notes. And this was the big event. There was some kind of bad blood and lack of cohesion, it felt like, in the courtroom, and you heard about among the 3 defense counsel. Is that right? And do we know anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, just what limited I know, and you could see it, Harry, in the courtroom, is that Susan Necheles is the most experienced trial lawyer at that table by a very long shot. Whatever anyone thought of her Stormy Daniels cross examination, and I thought her first day cross was pretty focused. She also has a courtroom presence, and she knows how to tell a narrative, and she's telling a story. Todd Blanche doesn't do any of that. I mean, during his cross exam, I'm not trying to pile on somebody who just had a loss, but when he did his cross examination of Cohen, it was throwing a lot of marbles up in the air and sort of seeing where they landed. And to some extent, you could argue that that was effective in terms of it kept Cohen off his game. He never got under Cohen's skin, and Cohen was very well prepped, number one. And number two, it was very obvious that Susan Necheles was being sort of pushed to the end of the table. And Todd Blanche likes to do things a certain way and has a lot of faith in his abilities, and that's fine. But the main difference between Steinglass and Blanche's closings was that Steinglass had a story he was telling, backed up by an enormous amount of documentation. And Blanche had Michael Cohen's a liar, which you knew when Michael Cohen came in the door that he had told lies, and he acknowledged it.
And Blanche had one more thing, which is he'd been designated by Trump. That must have rankled Necheles. And I think also, I've heard that Necheles didn't sign certain briefings, and she's thinking about what would happen after the trial is done, I guess.
So I did a little bit of reporting on this. So not only did she not sign the pretrial, not all of them, but several of the pretrial motions, but she got into a confrontation with Trump after she lost the Allen Weisselberg case. She had represented Weisselberg. And Trump, to her face, and somebody who was in the room told me this, called her a loser. You're a loser, Susan. And she's, been a very esteemed attorney for a long time. She wasn't going to take any shit from him. And she said, I didn't lose that case. Allen Weisselberg lost that case because he was guilty. And she just wasn't going to take it from Trump. And anybody who's not, as Maggie knows, better than anybody who's not servile to Trump is not going to stay in his favor for very long. And you could sense a little bit of that, although I think they were trying to repair it. Like I noticed one day, Boris Epstein, fist bumped Susan after her cross and, smiled at her. And he, in part because he's so sycophantic, but he has a fair amount of influence. Joe Tacopina quit because of Boris Epstein, so he wasn't the only one. So there might be some tensions, but I think that Maggie is right that the basic problem is that Todd Blanche was the lead attorney. He was totally inexperienced. It was like his second case or something.
And the first one was like not a significant case.
Right. And it was a nothing thing.
And the basic problem that makes that basic problem is you had the client making several decisions and they were spectacularly bad. I got one word, Costello, right? Yeah.
Right, he should have said to Costello, Mr. Trump, President Trump, I know that you like the way he testified on Capitol Hill last week, calling Michael Cohen a liar, but it's so much worse for our case to put on witnesses. We just need to say they haven't made a case. we're not putting on any defense witnesses. Because what they were wondering, like, I thought one of the weakest parts of Blanche's closing argument is he says, why didn't the prosecution call Eric and Don? And, if you're a juror, you're saying, well, why didn't the defense call his own sons rather than Costello? If they're going to call witnesses and these guys signed 2 of the checks, like, let's hear from them, from the defense. Tell everybody your father's telling the truth. That didn't happen. And they were, Don was only there, but Eric was there like every day in the sight line of the jury, so they blew that. Then 2 other things very quickly. He totally blew. He insulted the intelligence of the jury. He said he did this on opening and closing. He said, you should only be in there for 5 minutes, or basically said there's a quick and easy decision. They just heard a ton of evidence that they needed to go through. He was insulting their intelligence. And then all of them know that Access Hollywood was a big deal. They were all voters in 2016. They know he was a big deal. And there was no way they could believe that it was just another bump in the road for the campaign, like down 2 points in Michigan, or the New York Times wrote a bad article. It was not that kind of problem for them. It was like code red. And every juror knew that.
And 100%, yeah. I mean, it was offensive. It's funny. We've all been remarking all through the last several weeks that there's no narrative. And then the Times had reporting in the last weekend that was like, well, at least this would be a narrative. Where is Weisselberg?
Maggie, can I ask you what happened with Where's Weisselberg?
The story was just about this witness who wasn't called. And, it's not my reporting, so I want to be a little careful here. But my assumption as to why Weisselberg was not called is that it was not clear what he would say. And, and not because prosecutors thought that he was going to reliably tell the truth. I think they thought prosecutors believed he would not tell the truth. And remember, Weisselberg, we did a big story about this before the trial began, but the difference between how Donald Trump handled Michael Cohen and Alan Weisselberg is a couple of $1 million. Michael Cohen ended up getting shoved off on an ice floe and had his legal fees not paid. And Alan Weisselberg got a severance agreement and had his legal fees paid. So there was, I think, a concern on the prosecutor's part that it would just complicate matters. And the third man piece is there's 3 people who were ostensibly in this meeting: Weisselberg, Donald Trump, Michael Cohen, when they decide how the payments are going to be structured and booked. That piece of the case, not all of the case, that piece of the case relied on Cohen, because Cohen is who puts all 3 of them in that meeting. I believe that is why Weisselberg was not called. And to your point, look, the defense would say, and have said, the burden of proof is with the prosecutors. So we're not going to call these people to fill this in because that's their job. They certainly could have called Schiller, but they didn't.
Schiller just effectively ducked. It's 100% clear to me why they didn't call Weisselberg. I'm just saying it put in mind, there's a counter narrative of all things, the things they've been missing. They didn't call Weisselberg because, as a prosecutor, you don't want to put on anyone who you haven't prepped or been in the grand jury or know who they were going to say. And they could call him and he'd legally be obligated. But as a result of the severance agreement that said you may not cooperate with them voluntarily, he would not talk to them. And they were scared to put him on. And I really want to pick up on Maggie's point about, how different it was in the room. And not because we're so smart or insightful or experienced, but there's a natural tendency in the media to just try to distill a whole day into 1 or 2 little, what seem to be dramatic moments. But also, I just wonder, if anyone has further thoughts. What did we see and feel and experience that just was impossible to really ever get the full flavor of to the American people?
I think a big part of it was like Costello and how bad Costello came off to everyone who watched it. Because when you read back the transcript, and MSNBC did a lot of readbacks, right? I think Lawrence O'Donnell's entire show for 6 weeks was readback of transcripts. But it doesn't quite capture how aggressive and hostile a witness he was, and kind of how bad of an idea it was ultimately to put Costello on the stand for numerous reasons. I mean, first of all, it just seems like a bad defense legal strategy in the first place. They put Trump legal team put Costello in the grand jury to try and stave off an indictment. And Costello said everything in the grand jury that he was going to say on the stand, which gave the DA's office an entire year to prep against his testimony. And I just thought that was crazy. The second thing was, as a result of that prep, he was so thoroughly impeached, it wasn't even funny. Like, the DA's office pulled up the emails where Costello writes, Cohen is an asshole. It is so abundantly clear that Cohen's best interests were not at Bob Costello's heart. Like, that was not what Bob Costello was doing. When he is talking about, we got to get this guy on side, does he know who he's dealing with? He's dealing with the president of the United States. Like, it just shows to any layperson that Costello was thoroughly in the tank. I don't know how to say this any more eloquently than just to say he was in the tank for Trump. And it was so clear. And when he started kind of sniping at the judge, and when he started making these comments under his breath, we talk a lot about how juries feel close to the judge. And I think this jury in particular felt pretty close to Merchan. And I just think that did the defense no favors whatsoever.
Can I add to that? Which is one thought I had as Hugo was talking. I agree with everything Hugo said. Another thing that I think is impossible to capture, and Hugo, I think you were in the courtroom proper a bunch of times. I know Jon was consistently, and I was almost every day. It's impossible to describe what it was like watching Trump roll in heavy with this expansive members of the House, governors, vice presidential potential picks as running mates, a convicted former NYPD commissioner, Trump's own indicted top legal advisor, Boris Epshteyn. There was a moment, and Jonah Bromwich and I did a story about this, but there was a moment when Michael Cohen was in the middle of testifying, literally midway through a question about when was the moment when he decided not to stay loyal to Trump anymore. And suddenly, in the middle of his testimony, the doors open. It's the middle of the afternoon session, or it's midway through. And in comes Burgum and I think Vivek Ramaswamy and some security aides. And it didn't end up disrupting Cohen, but we were all certainly aware of it. And it was like the living embodiment of everything, A, that Cohen was talking about in terms of Trump's demands for loyalty, and B, what Trump's team keeps insisting was really just Cohen freelancing. And so I've never seen anything like this. I have covered courts off and on. It's been a long time since I covered it as a beat, but I've never seen anything like this where there was so much behavior from the defendant and his team that just basically undergirded the prosecutor's arguments. Normally, you'd want to have family members, close friends, people in the jury looking out to see this person, is not who they're being portrayed as. And actually, all these atmospherics with Trump were just underscoring, actually, no, I am who they're saying I am. The weirdness of having Boris Epshteyn there every day really can't be overstated. And I think that look, Boris Epshteyn is a top Trump advisor. He is a conduit between Todd Blanche, his own former lawyer, and Donald Trump. He helps manage that relationship between Blanche and Trump. But when the key witness in the trial is Trump's former lawyer, who himself was indicted and convicted and served prison time, I don't think we can overstate how unusual this was and how much it really didn't come through in the copy because it was atmospherics, not trial testimony.
Totally agree. I mean, and Trump would roll in like this alpha male. Remember, I added up, we saw him coming in and out of court 160 times, 8 times a day. At the beginning, break, lunch, afternoon break, leaving. You multiply that by 23 days. He's rolling in and out like the alpha male every day. It's not very appealing. I mean, he does have a lot of presence, obviously, but the jury determined very early that they were not awed by his presence because they didn't look at him as they went in and out of the court, except juror number 2, which I want to talk to you about, Harry. But I think to Maggie's point, on top of that, the story that Maggie broke at the beginning, she was the first one to print that he was sleeping. And I think a lot of the public thought, oh, okay, it's boring in parts. Okay, big deal, he sleeps. He was asleep for large chunks of this trial, large chunks, or at least resting his eyes if he wasn't actually asleep. And that's in a direct sightline with the jury. They can see that. That is just on its own, it's disrespectful. Like, they're staying awake. They're sitting through all this evidence. Can't the guy who's on trial show enough respect to the court to just keep his eyes open? It's a simple thing, but I think it was important. And then just very briefly on the witnesses. So if people are interested in why Weisselberg didn't testify, there was a hearing with the jury out. It wasn't a sidebar, and it's in the transcript. And both sides talk about why they don't want him. And what Blanche says is it raises a series of complicated issues, quote unquote. And then a couple of other times he talked about invoking. He was talking about invoking the Fifth. They didn't want to have him as a witness for the defense invoking the Fifth. That would have looked really bad for the defense. And I think on the prosecution side, as has been mentioned, they didn't trust, since he was already a perjurer, maybe just keep perjuring himself, because he still had money to come from a $750,000 golden parachute with the Trump organization. It hadn't all been paid out yet. So if the prosecution had brought him in, there was a very decent chance that he would just do what he's done before and just lie for Trump. And they already had this, what they call smoking gun, in his handwriting. I thought one of the most important parts of the early trial was this guy McConney. They didn't even have to bring in a handwriting expert. This guy McConney, who was, worked for the Trump organization, he said, "Oh yeah, that's Alan Weisselberg's handwriting." And at that point, that was, very serious blow to the defense very early in the trial.
Can I just pick up on one thing that Maggie said that I'd forgotten about, which is, I've never covered a mob case or, been in court for a mob case, but it felt like every time Trump walked in with his entourage, and it was dozens of people with his security detail and all these guys, like big guys, kind of walking in, it felt like this was like a mob boss. And I know it's like a cliche that gets used a lot to describe Trump and Trump world, like it's some sort of like mafia organization, but it really gave off that air as though this was, a guy rolling in heavy, literally. And if I'm a jury, I don't know, I can't imagine anyone had an ounce of sympathy when he comes rolling in like that. The defiant narrative that he likes to do, he likes to look very serious, and in the photos, in the photo call that they have right before the trial started every day, he looks very like angry and defiant. And that's fine for the MAGA crowd, but I can't imagine that helped him whatsoever with 12 ordinary people who aren't particularly focused and following politics.
This is something that we saw throughout this trial, and we were talking about the commentary outside the courtroom. Trump has always conflated legal problems with PR problems or political problems, and I would say that was a big piece of it. I mean, the number of people in Trump's world who were sending around texts during the Cohen cross-examination by Blanche going, "This is a slam dunk, it's over," and it wasn't.
I did want to mention he would come in before the jury was seated, but still the entourage and the mob feeling was the same. This is, I think, the big point. What is that feel, that air, as you put it, Hugo? That's one of 10,000 pieces of data that people use to assess and take a measure of the person. That's what people do. That's what juries do. So the impenetrable, I think, challenge of reporting, and why we saw something just so different that just can't be communicated. Juries make credibility determinations, and it's a very complicated but very human basic thing. I mean, right? If you get evolutionary on it, you decide fast, is somebody to be trusted or not. And we sat in that room, and you saw Pecker, and after 20 minutes, whatever rogue, loose figure he was telling the truth. You feel it. Same with Stormy, and same with Michael Cohen. These were not, I think, borderline calls, but that's the heart and soul of the jury system. And I think it's just impossible to reassemble, especially in a cable TV kind of setting where you describe certain dramatic things that happen. And of course, there's also the relative judgment. You make a judgment, is this guy or that guy lying to me? And you have Trump and, the completely unviable story that he didn't sleep with Stormy or McDougal, etc. So I just think it's probably an impossible problem. America didn't see it on TV. And so the impact now going forward is, at best, really muted.
This other thing that I don't think is very communicable across print or even kind of descriptions on TV is Michael Cohen looked kind of resigned at times, especially all the way through 3 days of his testimony. It wasn't the look of someone who was making up a story in order to get Trump convicted. And it's this kind of indelible but indescribable kind of sense of he looked just very exhausted.
I agree with you, Hugo. I totally agree.
And you look at that and you don't go, this is a guy who is trying to sell more books, or he's trying to sell apparel, or he wants more listeners on his podcast. It looked like someone who had just had enough. And for then Todd to say, he's making everything up for his own benefit and he's got a financial interest in this case, it just didn't come across that in his body language or demeanor and testimony.
Well, part of the problem too is that, just thinking about how Hugo was describing that, Blanche juiced up some reporters before he did his big Perry Mason moment about here's the text from Keith Schiller, and the thing about the theft was another thing. But to Hugo's point, those were two events over the course of 3 days of cross-examination where Cohen really did stay very, very level. And Blanche's whole argument, other than that Cohen is freelancing, it's also that everybody else around Trump has some impure motive and they're all taking advantage of Trump. And I think that Pecker in particular made that, and frankly, Hope Hicks and Madeline Westerhout also really punctured that argument.
Totally. And also his other argument, if he lies once, everything's a lie. And of
Right.
course, even that one wasn't such a lie. But again, the jury would say, no, I'm looking at the guy. I know what you're saying, but I'm looking at the guy. All right. Maggie, I'm sorry. I want to start with you, even though you just spoke on this, because I think you probably know Donald Trump. God bless you, as well as anybody out there, and for years. So he is making a kind of Brer Rabbit. This is my high literary episode strategy of, oh, this is great. We got all these contributions after, and he's making it seem as if he wants to keep this alive and run as the sort of martyr, and Joe Biden tried to put him in prison. You would think the obvious thing to do is there's still enough time to let this fade, especially since we didn't see it on TV. Do you assess that, in fact, this is going to be a literal cornerstone of his campaign?
I think a couple of things. He's not happy he got convicted. There was all of this commentary from Republicans when he was first indicted in this case on, yeah, and it absolutely was politically good for him when he got indicted in the middle of that primary. It froze the field, it froze Republicans, but he's not happy to be convicted. He's just not. However, they are very happy to have this massive influx of contributions. That's true. And I think that there is certainly benefit in terms of galvanizing the Republican base. I think anyone who suggests that they have any idea whether this will ultimately be electorally beneficial to him is lying to you. Nobody has any idea how this is going to play out. Will an event that happened now matter in 5 months when the election takes place, or even in a month when there's the first debate? I mean, probably, because I imagine Biden, who seems to suddenly want to lean into this after not for a long time, will mention it. But there is little in the polling to indicate there is going to be some sweeping change. Could it matter at the margins? Sure. I don't think this is necessarily going to be the cornerstone, Harry, of his campaign. I think it's what he wants to talk about right now. And I mean, to be fair to him and to his campaign, this is what everybody wants to talk about right now. So they're just maximizing what they can.
Yeah, I would just say that it's really important when nowadays everybody's a pundit, which is fine. But if you've covered politics for a long time, you know that May is actually quite early. And there are just many, many bends in the road ahead. And it's really hard to predict what they're going to be. I remember in 1992, I was covering that campaign, and Bill Clinton was running third in May, quite a distant third. So now it's June. But so there's a lot of things that will take place. The first one is the debate. And I think Biden has an opportunity there. It'll be interesting to see whether he takes it, obviously, as a broader opportunity. But, his son is going on trial. And my guess is that what Biden will say is, look, you think I'm happy about my son being on trial? I'm not happy. But I'm not going to attack the jury and the judge in his case, because that's not the way we do it in the United States. So if he's convicted, it will be very sad for me, sad for him. But what Donald Trump is doing now in attacking the jewel of our constitutional system is reprehensible. It's really bad for our country. And I would ask you, Donald, to stop doing it. And I don't know whether that'll happen, but there are ways for this to develop in ways that are not just martyrdom for Trump. I think right now everybody's assessing this just in terms of the upside for Trump, even on the money side. So $34 million is a lot of money, but it costs $1 billion to run for president. So is he going to do this 10 more times? Maybe he'll do it a couple more times. At sentencing, he'll make more money. But it's very, very expensive to run, and people keep score in kind of a phony way. They've gotten into a lazy-minded way of just measuring how he does after he has a legal setback. And then I think the other big event is obviously the sentencing. The danger for Republicans is that they are so incensed by this sentence, whatever it is, that they get trapped into having their whole convention be defending this felon.
The other thing that's really interesting about this is the polling, because publicly the Trump campaign, likes to point to these polls that show that Trump didn't lose any support over the course of the trial, or that his numbers remain kind of remarkably steady, which they were. But inside Trump world, and even inside some of the super PACs, there is very little reliance on these polls as being instructive for anything that will come down the road. I don't know if Maggie, you kind of heard the same thing, but certainly it has been my sense that they look at the polls and go, it's good for us that nothing has really changed. But no one seems to be looking at that and extrapolating out, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, and saying, and therefore we will be fine at the election. I think it's true that they have no clue either.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that they are, look, they correctly see this election as trench warfare. It is, every election is a game of inches, but this is a bizarre election because you have a former president and a current president who are both historically unpopular running against one another in with a trial having just taken place and two wars taking place internationally and certain economic uncertainty and on and on and on. And so the wiser people around Trump world are not saying, yes, this therefore means everything's great. They're just saying, we don't think today that the trial is changing anything. And the polling all, suggests that. Again, it's also, there was a memo that Tony Fabrizio, the Trump campaign's main pollster, sent out before, which stressed that there will probably be some bump for Biden or some kind of effect in national polling publicly, because that will incorporate California and New York and Illinois and places where voters are more inclined to celebrate this verdict and have it say it impacts their vote. But we don't have a national election. We don't have a national popular vote election. So I don't know what it's going to look like.
I feel also that I don't have a sense of it as well, but it had been the case over the last several weeks that people were citing polls that suggested it would matter. But it just seems to me we're on, the 18th time, starting with Access Hollywood, when it felt that way, but it didn't come through. I just want to make another legal prosecutor point, which is it's not just the label of felon, but he's been brought down here during the 3, 4, 5 weeks. He sat there like a defendant, as you put it, often sleeping. But, the sense of Trump, who does whatever he wants and tells anyone to screw themselves if he wants to, not being able to, that's going to be repeated. So sentencing, he's going to stand in front of the judge and just take it, whatever it is. And at the very least, there's going to be some serious, lecturing and tug wagging. But before that, he's going to sit in the grimy probation office. He's on the other side of a very big divide, I just want to say, in the justice system, and I live mainly on that side. And once you're in you're a convict now, there's just going to be a series of reminders. If what is salient is just seeing Trump as sort of, brought down and a convict, he's not done. There are going to be procedural junctures over the next several months where that's going to be repeated.
So there's two things that the judge indicated are coming: a probation meeting and a probation report. Probation interview is what the first one is called. And my understanding is that at the probation interview, the probation officials want to know what the felon is thinking. Are they saying, look, I am remorseful, I want to stay out of jail for my family, it would really just mean so much to me if you could let me off with a fine, and I really respect the process and think that I got a fair trial even though I lost?
Any asshole who's been completely unrepentant in trial does that. There's no reason not to, but, presumably he's incapable of it.
I don't think he's going to. I mean, Maggie, do you think in the probation interview that he will make nice to the court?
I try not to predict, but I mean, I will make one point, which is that, yes, there was a moment when Mershon scolded him for muttering loudly where the jurors could hear during jury selection. And there was another moment where he told Blanche at a sidebar to get his client under control. Something Blanche did very well during this trial was get Trump not to damage himself in front of the jurors. And I say that as somebody who watched the Carroll trial. There was no jury in the Engoron trial, the civil fraud trial, but Trump in both was muttering and shaking his head, and he thought he was bonding with the jurors in the Carroll trial. He really wasn't doing that here, and that was not a small accomplishment by Blanche. So there are times when Trump can be more demure, for lack of a better way of putting it, but I don't think it's just going to be what takes place in that moment. Prosecutors are going to walk in with weeks of Trump attacking the judge or attacking Bragg or attacking the system, and I think that will matter as much as anything.
Demur, yes. Contrite, no.
And the thing about the pre-sentencing interview is the moment that Trump got convicted, the next day he went to Trump Tower and basically went on a 30-minute rampage about the case and said it was all unfair. There's not a shred of remorse. And even if Trump cuts a low figure in the interview proper, and I do agree with Maggie that Trump seems to listen to Todd a lot more than any other lawyer, and I think it's part of their relationship. They're very close.
100%.
But the other stuff that Trump has done in the meantime, publicly, even after the case has ended, is going to cut against him, because that's the sort of thing that prosecutors can pull in their pre-sentencing.
Completely. And when it comes to probation, all kinds of other stuff, the Trump Organization conviction, maybe the sexual assaults, he's in a different spot now. All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thank you, Harry. In today's spirited debate, we hop into the beer cooler to ask the question, to IPA or not IPA? The India Pale Ale has become synonymous with the word hoppy. And it's that hoppiness that's created a bittersweet relationship with IPAs that has divided beer lovers across the world into two categories. Those who love this style of the pale ale for its full flavored bite with flavors of lemon and pine needle, plus typically higher alcohol content. And then those who prefer a little less sharpness with each sip. So what gives IPAs that signature bite? Well, there's another abbreviation you should know, IBU, which stands for International Bitterness Units. The higher the IBU, the more bitter the beer. Luckily, at Total Wine & More, we carry an array of IPAs that offer up a huge range of hoppiness. We've all been bitten by a hoppy IPA in our past. Swing by your local Total Wine & More and let our guides find you an IPA that's more YOU. So find what you love and love what you find. Only at Total Wine & More. Cheers!
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine and More for today's A Spirited Debate. All right, God, I wish we could talk about this for another hour, but we're nearly out of time. I've been struck in the day or two as people are processing it of a fair diversity of opinion among folks like us about the sort of takeaway lesson of it all. I just wanted to give each of you a chance, if you wanted, to give your kind of bottom line thoughts about this historical phenomenon that we all witnessed.
So it's been since the late 1860s when Ulysses S. Grant was out in a carriage and got a speeding ticket. That's the last time any president of the United States has come into contact this way with the criminal justice system. Nixon, of course, was pardoned. So I think that the larger point is that the rule of law did have a victory. And it's important to savor those victories. We need to defend our institutions, make sure that Trump doesn't rip down our institutions. And even if he's out, yakking in a very predictable way, people who believe in the system at some level for all its faults should be celebrating. And it is a good day, as grim and sordid as this trial was, it is a good day for America because the system did work. That doesn't mean the system is safe. It doesn't mean the system is going to ultimately work. But this is the only trial we've even had of Donald Trump. The rest of them he's managed to delay. So I think there are kudos deserved for Alvin Bragg and his team, and it was a good day for democracy.
I take a slightly different take, Harry, which is that he was like any other criminal defendant. He had the presumption of innocence. He was convicted by 12 people who took less than 2 days to come up with their verdict. He has been indicted in 4 places with all of the documentary evidence and the witnesses. This was not a weak case. What it was not was a particularly weighty case when you compare it to the January 6th related case or the documents case that where Trump was accused of obstruction and holding on to classified material. And so I think the problem with this trial having been not just the first, but probably the only, certainly before the election and maybe ever, is that it was always going to be the one that was going to be the most controversial. And so what that means for the country in an electoral capacity, which is where we are, I just don't know.
From a purely legal standpoint, I was thinking about what Todd Blanche was saying on Fox hours after the verdict and how he wouldn't have done anything else differently. Part of me is sympathetic to that because it was in many ways a case that was buttressed by so much evidence and a lot of the documentary material. And yet on the flip side, there were so many mistakes, I think. It's always 2020 in hindsight, but there were so many mistakes, I think, that Todd made at various points, both in the pre-trial phase, also at trial. The decision to put Costello on the stand, the decision to say there was no sort of affair at all with Stormy Daniels, the fact that they said there was no reimbursement. I mean, there was a number of strategic mistakes that they made all the way through. And I think those things could have been redone. But at the end of the day, I think the outcome would have still been the same. It's an interesting legal case in that sense.
I agree with what everyone has said, and in particular, how it might play. But I'm basically on the Alter old goat plan because we don't want law being omnipresent in our lives. We just want it there when it's really needed. Here was a place where it was, and it came through. And that, to me, is entirely consistent with the possibility that the political storm we're in the middle of or entering will wipe it all out, which would be a catastrophe and all those things. But that it actually functioned, and not simply with the points you're making, Hugo, but also around sort of hailstorms of pressure brought by Trump and his entourage and, the whole hurricane that sometimes 100 Center Street seemed to be. That to me is also a good day. It's not the last day. We're not out of the woods, but we wouldn't want law to solve all our problems, but we want them to solve, when criminals commit crimes. That's, I think, really an important point.
And we should salute public servants like
Yes.
that team. Steinglass has worked for 26 years in the DA's office. He could be making 5 times as much money.
He actually made a comment of it to the jury, right? Which you wouldn't do if you didn't have some affluent Manhattanites.
I think that this is a pretty brave group of jurors who, we sat in that courtroom, we all watched them. They were, for the most part, expressionless. It was extremely hard to derive what they were thinking. There's another juror who the Trump team actually thought was with them, John, just FYI. And it was just based on a total misread of whatever. And I think in some cases, just complete magical thinking. But these are people whose lives are never going to be the same and who are now being pushed to be doxxed and having all kinds of stuff said about them by Trump supporters. And that, to me, is actually the biggest example of where the system worked, because in a system that is built on trials of your peers, these are folks who showed up. I've never seen such an attentive jury. They were really, really engaged. They took their work really seriously. And what they will deal with after that, I think, is an open question. But I just want to make that point.
And there's an end. Thanks so much, Maggie, Hugo, and Jon. We'll be unfolding this for weeks and months. I hope you'll come back to help us. We're out of time. Thank you so much, Jon, Maggie, and Hugo. And thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts. And please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. You can follow us on Twitter at TalkingFedsPod, and you can look to see our latest offerings on Patreon. Talking Feds is a completely independent production, so if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the show, Joining our Patreon is the best way to do it. You can leave voicemails with your questions for me and our guests, whether for Talking 5 or general questions about the inner workings of the legal system for our sidebar segments. All you have to do is call 727-279-5339 and leave a voice message. You also can still email us your questions at questions@talkingfeds.com. Thanks for tuning in. And don't worry, as long as you need answers, the feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Catherine Devine, associate producer Gabriella Gluck, sound engineering by Matt McGardle. Our research producer is Zeke Reed. Rosie Don Griffin and David Lieberman are our contributing writers. Production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu and Anna Salvatore. Our music, as always, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.